Tonight, on behalf of Harvard Bookstore, I am honored to introduce Alan Shawn to discuss his latest book, Twin. In his memoir, Alan Shawn attempts to comprehend his mentally disabled twin sister. At the age of 8, Mary disappears from his life and is placed in a school, a place filled with people who had a way of understanding her. Shawn's balanced writing include scientific research, the details of Mary's official diagnosis of autism, and heartbreaking images like containing a, quote, a kind of ocean of disquiet in me. Michiko Kakutani of the New York Times describes Twin as an, quote, extraordinary book that combines the sympathetic insight of Oliver Sacks's writings with Joan Didion's autobiographical candor and Mary Karr's sense of family dynamics. Alan Shawn is a pianist, a composer of chamber and orchestral music, and a professor at Bennington College. Professor Shawn is the author of 2 previous books, Arnold Schoenberg's Journey and Wish I Could Be There. Without further ado, ladies and gentlemen, please join me in welcoming Alan Shawn.
Can you hear me? Good. Thank you for being here. A very strange experience for me to give a reading. I'm a musician first and foremost, and a composer, and I never intended to be a writer at all. So without my piano, I feel very shy and nervous. But I also feel shy and nervous because there are a lot of things that one can write on a piece of paper and send out into the world that are hard to say to other people in person. So for me to read out loud these words that I've written down might seem easy to you, but for me it's very strange because this book and the last book I wrote were simply attempts on my part to put into some kind of coherent order very chaotic experiences and difficult experiences. When I wrote my first book about Arnold Schoenberg, I also was writing about something difficult. And in fact, I would quip occasionally when I was talking about my second book that both phobias and Schoenberg make people run. And and there is something that I seem to be doing in all 3 books that has to do with mediating between something complicated and mysterious and the world, and mediating between something complicated and people who are trying to grasp this complicated and difficult thing. And I suppose that impulse started with my childhood experience with my sister Mary, and trying to interpret her to my parents, actually, initially, and maybe my brother as well. I had a difficult time stylistically with both of these memoirs. As some of you know, I come from a family that was that prized its privacy, but was somewhat known. I think it'll be less and less the case that my father's name will ring a bell necessarily to people, or maybe that's not true. Maybe it will ring a bell even more 100 years from now. I don't know. But my challenge was to write about a serious subject, which was in the first memoir, phobias and fear and crippling anxiety, in the context of family life, but with the awareness that I was talking about a family that people had heard of. So I tried to take advantage of that, on the one hand, by drawing attention to my dad as somebody that people would generally think was an accomplished person, and also to point out that this was someone who suffered terribly from the kind of anxieties I was talking about. So I tried to take advantage of it. At the same time, I didn't want that book to be put in the bin next to all the other books about the New Yorker. In fact, that was a horrifying thought. I wanted that book to be meaningful, particularly to people who had troubles of the kind that I was talking about. And those people might be I had a fantasy while I was writing the book that this book would go to some, train conductor in India who had terrible phobias but felt safe on the train. And he would read this book, and he had no knowledge of what the New Yorker was or any interest in my father whatsoever. For that reason, I didn't use names in the book. I wasn't coy about it. I referred to my father and brother and so on in the introduction, and I referred to the New Yorker. After that, I referred to the magazine, and I referred to my father, and I didn't use names. The only name I used was Mary, my sister, because I thought, as I wrote it, that I wanted her to emerge in the book as a central person, and I wanted you to forget which family I was writing about. So when it came time to write this book, which I had no plans to do when I was writing the previous memoir, I basically stuck to that same approach. I tried to abstract my family and make it just about families and about father and mother, and father is doing these things. Some of these things are done by many people. Some of them are unusual to him, or somewhat unusual to him. I tried to abstract it. So, of course, when the book is received, everyone then puts the names back in, and that's just life. And I mean, I can't escape the fact that we are talking about real people. But that attempt to abstract was my way of, again, creating a kind of coherence out of a universality, you might say, out of a very personal experience that was, as I say, chaotic and difficult. And you might ascribe other motives to me too, which you might mention in the question and answer period. I don't fully understand why I'm standing here, why I wrote these books. It's a very, very strange experience. I talk a little bit about discovering words near the end of this book, because I associate my sister with a nonverbal kind of communication. And that's the first thing that really struck me when I first heard music after her departure from my life. I was bowled over. And this music to me cut through everything. It cut through all the BS, and it cut through a kind of screen that was covering, a screen of decorum, you might say, that was covering my confusion and pain and fear and grief. All of these emotions are absolutely universal, and I think we all have our losses and griefs and separations and so on to deal with. So I tried to dwell on the universal aspects of my experience in writing the book and make something maybe somewhat useful out of my own experience. So it's very personal, but on the other hand, I was well aware while writing it that I needed to also make it readable and legible to others. So I thought I'd just read some short excerpts from a few different parts of the book. And there is, as Ryan said, there is some layman's research behind this. I am embarrassed if there are any scientists in the room. I have no aptitude for science or real knowledge of scientific matters. I am fascinated and by looking into things, and I refer to them in words that make sense to me, and I hope they're as accurate. I hope they're accurate. So I'll start with a little bit about Mary and myself in our home together in New York. I had a privileged childhood, I admit it, with some painful aspects to it, but a lucky childhood. I've had a lucky life. I wouldn't say I've had a privileged adulthood, but I've had a lucky adulthood. I've definitely, interestingly enough, both my brother and myself, we've really worked like dogs as adults. So somehow we weren't spoiled by our privileged childhood. Apparently, many more people start out in their mother's womb with a twin who never becomes a newborn than is commonly realized. Although experts on development differ about whether or not twin loss that occurs in utero leaves a psychological imprint in its wake, there is no disagreement about the fact that roughly 12% of pregnancies begin as twin pregnancies, and only 2% of those result in twin births. Identical twins occur when one zygote, fertilized egg, splits into two embryos, usually within the first 13 days after conception. So-called fraternal twins, created from two eggs fertilized by two sperm, are 3 times more common than identical ones, but unlike them, are more common in some cultures than in others. Such dizygotic twins are no more genetically alike than any two siblings. That is, they each share 50% of each parent's DNA, as all siblings do. They are also, in the vast majority of cases, separated by being in two amniotic sacs during gestation, with a thin membrane between them. Nevertheless, according to Alessandra Piontelli, who has summarized prenatal twin development in her book Twins, From Fetus to Child, even in what she describes as a life more akin to oblivion than to alertness, the developing twins begin to affect each other through their motions as early as 9 weeks. At 14 weeks from conception, twins are already rehearsing such motions as stroking their faces and taking small steps, often kicking their co-twin and causing their instinctive rooting response. Amazingly, but not surprisingly, the behavior patterns discerned in each twin during intrauterine life through ultrasounds appear to correlate to those after birth. Torpid twins remain so, jittery ones remain jittery, as do easily excited ones remain easily excited. Our amnesia about our early childhood makes it almost seem as if it takes years for the prenatal oblivion to wear off. We do not recall the shock of birth, and there is a kind of childhood fog that surrounds every memory from early life, no matter how vivid our experiences actually were, with a dreamlike haze. Surely all the intense learning and bonding and sensing and seeking of one's first days was all the more startlingly vital for being brand new. We certainly bear the scars and reflect the impact of the time forever. In 3rd or 4th grade, asked to write our autobiographies, I recalled an early memory, standing in front of an amorphous red blob I had painted and saying that it was a witch. In my recollection, friends of my parents, holding drinks in their hands, were asking me to explain who the witch was. Later in this autobiography, I referred to a memory that actually had to have come from an earlier time. My sister and I were in adjoining cribs, and we were rocking backwards and forwards in unison. We were knocking our heads gently but repeatedly on the headboards. I wrote about this nightly ritual at some length, innocent of sex, but still cognizant that the experience was private, collaborative, and even intense. That I called it a ritual shows that I instinctively knew the activity to be stabilizing, soothing, and necessary. This was a nightly routine in the period before my sister and I slept in separate rooms. If I close my eyes to my current world and responsibilities, I can imagine that I am back there on all fours, peering through the white slats of my crib at Mary's rocking form, blurry in the dark, but still visible by the Manhattan streetlights coming through the Venetian blinds. I can even hear the squeaking of the beds, hear the sound of the headboards being struck, and feel the mattress under my knees. But it is amazing how little else I can locate in my memory from my first 3 years, and strange that I would find only this one nightly activity and a lone red ink blot there when I search. In fact, we initially shared the same crib, and the ritual may well have begun there. We napped and slept together. We also shared a double stroller when we were taken out for walks in the sunlight of Central Park. We were fed at the same time. In photos from our infancy, Mary is taller and plumper than I am and tends to look calmer than I do. I appear irked and restless when being held, eager to wriggle free, whereas she seems docile and dreamy. The distinction that seems obvious looking at the photos today is that I am focusing outward, looking around me, where she could be described as lost in thought. Our brother, 5 years older, is already a seasoned extrovert, with a wide variety of grins, smirks, and waves, and some expressions that could only be characterized as ironic. Home movies taken when we are in our first year show Mary crawling more slowly than I do, and in one, when I roll over my head in an infant somersault, she attempts a similar move, but only partially completes it. I don't remember Mary starting to show any distress at this age. While I remember her screaming and running through the halls of the apartment as a 5 or 6-year-old, I have no sense of her unhappiness if she did display it as an infant or toddler. Sharing a room with her remains only the vaguest memory, more a feeling of textures and sensations, like the proximity of her small, warm form in frilly outfits, than a memory per se. I remember the comforting feeling of having her nearby, as if her presence was central, a point of rest. But I would only strain the limits of language trying to describe the sensation. Even now, I am more relaxed in her company than at any other time. I know now that sometime during her first year, my parents started to worry about Mary. Apparently, she did not smile until she was 6 months old and did not engage in play with adults when I did. She seemed entranced by objects, but not particularly responsive to or curious about people. Even more than in the case of the average infant, her concentration would fix on the immediate detail. At 6 months, she would put small objects to her nose to smell. At 12 to 15 months, she spent long periods staring at individual toys or at her hand. Her fascination with hands has in fact been lifelong. Even in our first year, when we were taken for walks to Central Park in our double stroller or placed in adjoining playpens, our parents apparently noticed additional discrepancies in our progress through the expected developmental stages. But their worry still centered more on what they assumed was their inability to engage Mary or make her happy than on whether she was innately impaired in some way. They were well aware that no two infants develop the same way or at the same rate. Sometime in our second year, her comparative unresponsiveness made them worry that she had a hearing impairment. That her hearing is in fact acute was later borne out by her ability to pick out melodies at the piano and her love of singing along with recordings of musicals, particularly Oklahoma and operas, Lucia de Lammermoor, as well as her sensitivity to noises, including her own shouts. At an early age, Mary's coordination was also tested. I remember her walking up and down the few steps of a wooden platform the size of a conductor's podium for hours at a time, which was a physical therapy that had been recommended for her. By the age of 2.5, her limited use of words caused her pediatrician concern, and he recommended that she be studied by a psychologist who was an expert in speech development. I remember watching a gentle young woman sitting with Mary at a small wooden table, asking her to do drawings and color in shapes with crayons. I remember Mary's hair being braided by Bessie, my parents' cook and housekeeper. The mysterious world of her costume jewelry, like the plastic pearls that popped into place to form bracelets and necklaces, her little dresses and black-buckled party shoes. I also remember the inwardness and inner-directed quality of her speech, her muttered dialogue with herself, her constant preoccupation with her right arm, which she would repeatedly kiss and then pause to look at, smiling to herself before resuming to kiss it. Her sometimes raw, chewed-on fingers, the start and stop quality her walking sometimes had, as if she were always reconsidering where she was going. I remember her tranquility, but also how it would shift unexpectedly. Sometimes the cause of her frustration would be apparent, like a plastic pearl falling from her grasp under the bed, and when the situation was righted, she would be contented again. But at other times, a tension would seem to mount inside her that had more the character of a meteorological event, and she would start to speak in a tense, strident voice, sometimes repeating phrases, which could have been wishes that called for reassurances or failed attempts to express some mysterious pain. She had a sideways, dark look sometimes, as if perceiving a threat or something ominous. If she were resisting doing something, she could start to kick and scream, and sometimes ran through the hallway holding her ears and yelling. I remember seeing my mother trying to hold her when she was kicking and crying out. I remember seeing her in a beautiful dress at one of our birthday parties, and the contrast between the pretty pink dress she was wearing and the green barrettes in her hair, and her desperate mood and tears of exasperation. The sound of Mary's screaming has stayed with me. When I first had children of my own, their cries upset me more than they should have, and I needed to be reminded that babies cry simply because that is their only way of expressing distress. From the moment my parents realized for certain that there was something the matter with Mary, they put me in my own room down the hall from her, with my brother's room between us, and began to shield me from her. It became less common for them to refer to us as twins. They began to protect me from her and encourage me to think of myself simply as an individual. Can you hear me okay? All right. Thank you. All right. Yes. Mary was a big child and could be fierce when she was unhappy. Although never aggressive toward people, she could still be destructive and self-destructive. At the age of 6 or 7, she sometimes smeared the walls with her feces. She bit her arm and tore the skin around her fingernails. My parents, who could only rarely manage to comfort Mary or feel that they understood her, increasingly placed her in the care of Bessie, who was physically stronger than they were and had an intuitive understanding of her. Since she was not Mary's parent, Bessie was probably less overwhelmed by the responsibility entrusted to her, and certainly less disturbed by the issues Mary's condition potentially raised. I mean, of course, the possibility that was certainly in their mind that they had caused Mary's condition. Having no children of her own, she wholeheartedly and unequivocally loved the three of us. My friend Jay remembers Mary banging angrily on the keys of the piano, and Bessie gently yet firmly hustling her away to her own room. Now, as you probably know, I devote some attention in the book to the theories of autism that were prevalent at that time, and I talk about Bruno Bettelheim's work at greater length, actually, than some people wish I did, because his name was known to me. He was somebody my parents mentioned, and in fact there was always the kind of hope in the back of their mind, and I think in my mind, that Mary would eventually go to Chicago to be cured. Looking into Bettelheim's work again and reading the books is very worth doing. I also really enjoyed the 2 BBC films that were made about him, in which he talked about his work and tried to modify some of what he had originally said particularly about mothers. And he was a complicated, obviously very complicated man who did some people a lot of good. And what I began to learn was that there are conditions that you might say mimic autism, or that present themselves as if they're autism, that are responses to trauma and rejection, and that are curable. And that, of course, once some of these cases were cured, it is logical, it makes sense that Bettelheim and others would think, well, obviously they're all like that. They can all be cured. I do think it's very complicated, and I was easier on Bettelheim than some people wish I was. But when I watched the videos and did the reading, I came to had a very complicated and somewhat sympathetic reaction to him as somebody who was maybe misguided in some ways and maybe fatally flawed in some ways, but did many people a lot of good as well, and had some very useful approaches to dealing with people with serious emotional problems. As you may know, also, my sister first went to a summer camp for emotionally disturbed kids at the age of 8, and then the camp turned into a school. It was on the Cape here. It was not too far from here, Chatham, Massachusetts. The decision to have her stay there, for all I know, had been made before she went to camp. I'll never really know. It was very hard to trace a lot of the facts behind this account. But nevertheless, when she left for camp, that was the last she ever set foot in that apartment until I brought her there when my mother was 99 years old. And I wrote about that in the book. So I'll read just a little bit about, because obviously this book deals all too much with me, because I remember my own life a lot more easily than I can remember anybody else's. So I really, when the title twin obviously refers to each of us. We're each the twin of the other. And one of the peculiarities of having written this book is that I can't discuss it with Mary, and I can't tell her that people have seen her face on the beautiful cover, which is really very meaningful to me, in a way more meaningful than the text is, to be honest. Seeing her circulate has a deep meaning for me. Circulate as a presence, and having her history reemerge as part of my family's history, surfacing, as it were, has a deep meaning for me. But I'll read a little bit about the apartment, or my feelings after she left. Perhaps it was just coincidental, but in Mary's absence, I became instinctively interested in the intangible sides of life, in invisible things. Pursuing my interest in dreams, for instance, I managed to get my parents and many of their friends to tell me examples of theirs for a school paper. One of our teachers astutely gave us the assignment to visit both a Protestant and a Catholic church, not a synagogue for some reason, and to write up our responses. I fell in love with the Catholic service. I am Jewish, by the way, in case you hadn't noticed. For a while, I attended Mass with some regularity. The congregation at the church I attended was Hispanic, mostly poor, and often elderly. The Mass was in Latin, a text I knew from music. There was a stone representation of the crucifixion and a monument to the Virgin who happened to have the same name as my sister. The space was cavernous, cold, echoing, and rarely terribly full. The priest's voice unfurled in the air in a murmuring sing-song. There were bells and chimes of various registers, the sounds of rustling coats when people rose and were seated, and of mumbled prayers ringing against the statuary. I said the prayers, I knelt, I participated, as an outsider, but in my mind as a kind of guest participant. This was the extent of my brief Catholic phase. Entering a religious space made sense to me. Even bowing down and worshiping made sense to me, even though specific religious beliefs made no sense to me at all. The idea of a religious space, the need to find a place where religious feeling is expressed, has stayed with me now. In fact, I'd hesitate to call myself a non-believer, because I find the question of whether one believes absurd, even irritating. Life is infinitely wondrous, infinitely cruel, and incomprehensible. What is there to believe or not to believe? My interest in religion eventually carried over to other school projects, such as our study of the Reformation, in which we read John Osborne's play about Martin Luther and Erik Erikson's analytic biography of him. I memorized much of Paul's letter to the Corinthians, without, of course, knowing that St. Paul was a former Jew who, like my father, had changed his name. In my wallet, I carried a picture of Martin Luther King Jr., in between one of my friend Jay and one of Willie Mays making an over-the-shoulder catch. Drawing, too, was an outlet everywhere and at all times of day. At home, any spare piece of paper or pad could become the background for a person's face. Half the faces I drew were of African Americans. The rest were father figures, complete with fedora, suit, and tie. I have to start the sentence again. The rest were father figures, complete with fedora, suit, and tie, assorted ministers and priests, and curvaceous women, even though depicting their curves required a degree of talent and knowledge of anatomy I didn't have. Now I'm going to read a little bit about, it's strange, but in the book there is a counterpoint between three types of writing. There's the pathetic attempt of the layman to understand certain scientific facts, but layman with a strong urge to understand. There's my attempt to remember Mary, which sometimes was excruciating, so much so that I had to stop several times. It was so both difficult to remember and unbearable. It was really terribly painful. It aged me, and then there was the kind of comic relief of my own life and its memory. So, not that my life is all funny by any means, but there was such a relief to be talking about sort of routine things. So I may read another routine passage, even that includes Harvard in it, just so you see that there is that element in the book. And my whole point is that even as I was trying so hard to establish some sense of individual identity, I was carrying Mary with me, and I was like Mary in so many ways. That emerged so clearly to me as I did try to put our two narratives together. That is my essential point, if I have one in the book, is that these distinctions begin to break down when you examine anyone closely, the distinctions between the normal and the less normal. And I make a strong case for my music being an autistic kind of world, my own corner of autism. Our first visits to Briarcliff, this is Mary's second institutional home where she still lives, and it's not called that. Our first visits to Briarcliff after Mary went to live there opened up a world of strangeness I hadn't known existed. The first surprise was the scale of the place. Then there were the residents. We saw lines of obedient adults of all ages walking in slow, shuffling groups like tired children at nursery school. Tall, skinny people with tiny, microcephalic heads, heavy-set, large-headed adults with drooping eyes and dragging feet, mature men and women with strange gaits, sometimes almost teetering off balance as they walked, like seals perched on their hind flippers with their hands held up in the air in front of them. Children are often obsessed with normality, trying to determine whether what is true for them is true for others, and reassuring themselves by comparisons with those who don't quite fit on the grid. Here was a whole world of people who apparently did not fit, none of whom could live independently, most of whom were, unlike Mary, visibly marked by their strangeness. If living with Mary had taught me early that the human mold is a rough generalization, full of variables, potential flaws, and botched patches, a lesson everyone has to learn eventually, the sight of the residents at Briarcliff greatly expanded upon this message. Just being at Briarcliff induced a kind of vertigo in an impressionable young person, calling into question the order of things and demonstrating that nothing could be taken for granted. For at least a time, children can generally believe in a fixity of categories, that old is old, young is young, beauty is permanent, a mind is a mind. I had an early lesson in human frailty. As Mary's twin, ignorant as I was about the cause of her impairments and with our twinship an almost taboo subject, I often found myself wondering if it was only a matter of time before the magic glue that held my own brain together would lose its adhesive properties and I would join the lines of shuffling institutional dependence at Briarcliff. Whatever anxieties Mary had suffered in adjusting to Briarcliff were not apparent when we saw her there, nor did she show the slightest surprise about her new companions. Briarcliff seemed in most ways a fortunate choice. The campus was divided into small units linked by pleasant tree-lined paths. In one respect, Mary's experience on the Cape was nearly replicated. Her individual unit, a likable one-story house with a gazebo and a picnic table outside, was home to roughly a dozen housemates, overseen by a live-in administrator and rotating shifts of aides. The residents of the home were all women, and they ranged in age from 18 to 80. The campus was dotted with such homes, some housing women, some men. There was also a section of the campus used as a day school for school-age children with learning disorders. For a few years, Mary continued to attend some classes there, but her days as a student were ending. The older men and women came together for work, wrapping packages, putting together boxes of goods, assembly line style, and on special occasions for parties and dances. Mary was now a working young adult. She drew a small salary for her package wrapping, which was put in an account for her and from which she could make purchases. Although she no longer took piano lessons, she continued to play the pieces she had learned at Sandpiper, that's the school in Chatham, Mass., and even one she remembered from musicals heard on recordings at home in New York, on a small upright piano in her unit. At church, she went to church, which she attended regularly, she played hymns, or Irving Berlin's Always, or The Hills Are Alive from The Sound of Music. With repetition, she had foreshortened some of these songs and played others with an oddly unmetered rhythm. She would sit down at the piano and begin playing almost in one motion, looking at the keyboard with intense seriousness, her plump, fleshy, small hands becoming her entire focus. Playing the piano, she looked exactly the way our father did editing manuscripts. Some years earlier, she had been taught accompanying left-hand chords that, while they minimized hand motions, also made for momentary dissonances, making one wonder what modern music would sound like to her. As always, the various timbres of her speaking voice remained terraced, like the dynamics in Baroque music, with little modulation or rise and fall from one level to another. She can murmur a whole thought to herself as if in one word. She can enunciate every syllable with a broad smile, teeth bared, as if at an elocution class. Milk and cookies. She can send the words out with the sound of a plaintive keening, as if she is worried. In each instance, sounding like a different person. What is rare is a sense of true verbal exchange. Emotion comes through her eyes and facial expressions, but rarely through her choice of words. Mary has an entire language at her disposal, but words are only a small part of it. As a child, it had sometimes seemed to me that Mary contained great wisdom, that because of some unwritten law she could not divulge. It was comforting to think that she belonged to a purposefully contemplative world, that she was like a monk on a mountaintop in Tibet, or an Indian seer who had taken a vow of silence, living on the streets of Calcutta, observing rituals on behalf of mankind generally. At Harvard, when I thought of Mary, it was as if she had become a mythological figure. I had been discouraged so often from seeking to know more about her life that I rarely remembered that I wanted to. Sometimes I tried to imagine her experience, having pains or torments for which I had no language, or for which, even if I could speak properly, there is no common language, or tried to picture how she viewed her parents or her brothers or her own changing body as she aged. I was dimly aware that while she did not understand my types of categories, the reverse was also true. She had rules and categories, and no doubt emotions that I was not privy to. In the competitive and personal cosmopolitan atmosphere of Harvard, I drew into myself, spending an inordinate time alone in my room, fantasizing about women and music and contemplating life's issues. It would never have occurred to me to use a word like depressed to describe my inwardness, and not once did I connect my feelings of solitude with being a twin or with unresolved feelings from childhood. I noticed only that my anxieties about sitting in groups and riding in elevators had increased. I also felt increasingly religious. Although I no longer attended Catholic Mass, I was particularly fond of medieval and Renaissance art, and I kept a print of Fra Angelico's Annunciation and a crucifixion scene on my wall, alongside a street scene by Van Gogh and a sentimental portrait of a voluptuous peasant woman with her blouse falling off by the French painter Jean-Baptiste Greuze. At Oxford, my brother hung the very same Annunciation on his wall. Neither of us consciously associated Fra Angelico's Mary with our sister. In the winter of my freshman year, my beloved piano teacher, Miss Dillon, died. There's been a lot about music in this book up until this passage here. She had spent the year in Vienna sending me postcards from the homes of Beethoven, Mozart, and Schubert, and written me a long letter in which she told me to always write from the heart. Her husband, Charles, wrote to me that her own heart had been ailing for some months and that she had died on New Year's Eve after raising a glass of champagne to toast him and their son. During my first 2 college years, the quality of my classwork was wildly uneven. I did well in Renaissance painting and in Japanese art. I received an A in philosophy on the strength of a paper about death, in which I argued that we cannot help but imagine death in terms of things we know. I then explored the many ways in which we betray the fact that we have illusions about something that is in fact pure nothingness. By contrast, I barely passed German. Transfixed by the stunning beauty of the young instructor, with whom I had once had a brief exchange on the subject of Alban Berg's steamy opera Lulu, I managed to oversleep my final exam. If this derived from my unconscious wish to speak with her one more time in person, that wish was granted. I pleaded my case with her, but only received a grade of D+. However, I still retain a vivid memory of her face and voice, and of the way her legs looked in fishnet stockings. Maybe she's here tonight. Most humiliatingly, I failed a course in Indian history for which I had actually worked quite hard. Some of the course readings on Buddhism and Hinduism had fascinated me and inspired me to write a paper on Gandhi's religious attitudes. However, this was at the expense of the historical and economic aspects of the course, and even of readings on some historical figures of religious significance. I did learn at Harvard, but in unexpected places. When I looked into a drop of water under a microscope in biology class and found there just as much feverish activity as could be seen by the naked eye in an anthill. When I dissected a live rat, that's what we did then actually, and saw with my own eyes the tangled arteries, beating heart, and tiny rubber-like organs that animated him. When I looked through the lens of the gigantic telescope in the Harvard Observatory, past a network of distant stars, at the rings of Saturn, and the pitted orange surface of Mars, I did not ever consciously relate all these small epiphanies back to Mary, or to the mystery of her humanity. I only knew that I was somehow hungry for understanding and looking for meaning in things. I remember the word being used early and then not being used. I don't think my parents knew that she was autistic for most of Mary's life until their death. I think they consider her retarded, and then there was an additional, which is technically correct. We don't use that term anymore, but then there was an additional diagnosis of schizoaffective disorder, which I disputed. And I think I sort of have persuaded them that was not really the case. I mean, I write a little bit about that, and trying to make the case that it's very, very hard to know what a person like Mary is imagining. After all, she's already subject to so many sensory experiences that are not common. If it's terribly hot or it's terribly noisy, she may look like she's seeing an enormous cockroach, to somebody else. But in fact, she's responding to something that is real but that happens to strike her a certain way that is not an average response. So anyway, that's a long discursive answer. But autism was used early on because I see that in some papers I have. But at the time, of course, it was primarily considered to be an emotional response. So then that was kind of not used so much anymore. Yeah. Well, I wish I saw her more than I do. My own difficulties traveling meant that I didn't go down by myself to see her for many years, and I saw her once a year with my mother when she was still alive in New York, not at my mother's apartment, but in a hotel, for lunch in a hotel. Then I fortunately got myself back down there, and I now do go down there regularly. She's still in this place, which I call Briarcliff. She is extremely well. She doesn't have very good teeth. It's very hard to get her to brush her teeth. Getting someone like Mary to take care of herself independently is very, very difficult. The people who work with her are, extraordinary. Their patience and devotion and ability to repeat the same things again and again are extraordinary. But she's well, and she seems. It's not clear that she can stay there, by the way, because the money for her to stay there ran out long ago. My parents were, my brother used the term virtuosos of financial, what did he say? I can't remember the last word, but anyway, it's bad. They weren't good with money. But originally, Mary was paid for, of course. But that money ran out, so it's a very complicated situation. Where she is, she's a very fortunate place to be. Those places like that have dried up. They don't exist anymore, and for partly very good reasons that people, it was thought, rightly so, I think, that people like Mary do better in group homes with supervision and so on. But she is well, and she seems better because my brother and I see more of her, I have to say. And, people say that autistic individuals lack the social component. Man, I could show you a couple of photos where she looks so happy that we're with her. And the people who work with her say that it appears to be the case that she is better. I describe at length a visit to her in which she's working at a kind of vocational facility. She has 2 jobs that I saw her do, work clearing trays in the lunchroom and working, sort of packaging things. And she takes it very seriously. She looks exactly like my dad at work. She has exactly the same concentration. And one of the things that is hard to describe is the keenness of this person. It really is an odd feeling. It's a little bit akin to the experience of being with Alzheimer's sufferers, because it's somebody you've known as very with it, and then you're still looking at this with it face, but they're not able to communicate very well. Mary's a bit like that. She just looks, she's terrific. She's a fascinating person. She looks like, she's about to do a poetry reading or something. But there's no actual communication. So she looks intelligent. Well, I kind of avoided that in the book. Actually, it's a strange thing about the book that I stop at the point where I finally think I can write decent music. But but it's a book about developing after all, and it's a book about not developing. So it seemed right that would be the case. But yes, I'm a composer. More people seem to read than listen to contemporary music, I've noticed. I feel that music is a deeper form of communication for me. As I say, that might not be. It might. You might agree if you all went out and listened to my music, but you might not. And that's something that's a strange thing about being slightly better known for the words I've written, because to me it's oh, that's odd. Why am I better known for these words? But everyone reads, and sometimes you don't know what you've done. And I realized I've written about what I could remember, about my own experience, and to me it was remembering and putting it down. Looking at it as a book is something I can't do. And if people tell me it's meaningful for them to read, then I have to listen to that and realize that it has an impact to read what I put down. But I must say that everything I have done creatively, both music and writing, seems to be very intimate. And I consider myself somewhat shy, but I am a confessional person in terms of my work, which is, you figure it out. But that seems to be true. I like to express my I'm not saying my feelings are so deep, but whatever I can find that feels deep to me, I try to express, and that's what matters most to me. So the reason I read the bits about religion, it's not that I subscribe to any religion. I don't. And I have zero actual beliefs. If you ask me my beliefs, I would express some irritation, as I say. But I am hungry for some kind of meaning, and in the various things I've done in both music and writing, I'm trying to understand. And I think it all goes back to some of these same childhood experiences, obviously. Oh, yes. Not what I read tonight, but from the book. Yes. I was saying that Mary she was a catalyst for the emotional bonding of our family. Partly because this was a family that was literate and very well behaved and all that. And Mary was not a part of that. Mary was essential. So she was an essential reminder at all times of the human animal and the urgency of emotion. And she reflected physically, particularly my father and my brother's look. So by mirroring their look, she kind of held us together. Obviously, she and I were connected, but not as much physically. And our mother was already, she didn't really need to be, her emotions were more evident already. But so Mary was like the glue that held us together as an emotional group. And after she left, we would talk. We would have these very interesting conversations. And we would sit around the dinner table and we would talk about the Vietnam War, and we would talk about Nixon, and we would talk about these, things that were extremely exciting and important, but they weren't about how we felt or, how we were doing as a family or that kind of thing. And I can't tell you much about that. Midway in writing it, I had lunch with her and I told her about it. And I said, "Is that okay?" And she said, "Yes." And then she asked for more French fries. And I can't tell you, that meant anything in particular. I just don't know. She has, as far as I know, I have sent the book to some people who were very helpful to me, as you can imagine, who work with her. Although they didn't tell me anything personal about Mary, because that's not done. She has her privacy, and I was. So I don't think they've shown her the book, but it's possible they have, and they may have shown her own picture. I will show it to her when I see her, and we'll. I mean, you can give me your email address, and I'll tell you how she reacts. The issue of her privacy was, it was on my mind, obviously, the whole time. And it's a difficult line to draw. I kept thinking that in some weird way I was doing something for her, writing the book. So that others might not, people, maybe not just for her, but for people who have a child or a relative who are similar to her, or so on. No, when she was younger, she looked completely normal. People would say that. Well, she looks completely normal, or she looks very, very beautiful. Now she's unusual. She's preoccupied with her food. She's very serious about eating, as we all should be. I think it's very important. But she's really, really working on that food. She's got more of a look of somebody who's in a different category, but at the same time there's a aliveness that is not captured by the typical stereotypical descriptions of autistic people. Each person is. I tried to make this point many times in the book, but each person, look at us. I mean, we're all, first of all, peculiar, but we're also so different from each other and idiosyncratic, and the same is true for any category. So she's perhaps more expressive than some people in her supposed category, but she does not initiate conversation. She repeats what you say and rarely says a sentence that is a complete surprise that comes out of nowhere. I mean, I remember one, for example, she once said, and it never left me, she said, "It's not snowing." And this was in the springtime. Now that was like a little poem, that was a perception. It was or a memory or something, but it was not what you expected. One reason why talking on the phone is not the way to get to know Mary is this. You have to look at her face and see her gestures and try to read her. But words are not where you're going to get the information about how she's doing. No! When I see her, it's the opposite. No, my sense of well-being is acute. And it's something I didn't even realize. I didn't get to be with her alone for a second between the age of 8 and how old am I now? Until maybe, until I was in I'm 62. So until I was in my 50s, between 8 and being in my 50s, I was never alone with her. So the situation we were in was scripted, and I didn't get to register even how I felt. But once I was alone with her and visiting her by myself, I realized, hey, this is so comfortable. I felt, this is a point of origin for me. It's a strange one in terms of other people's perceptions of the world, but it is where I started, so it feels good to me. Yeah. Yes. Sometimes the most obvious things, though, don't occur to you. So I didn't expect to be writing this book, or in a way I didn't even expect to be trying so hard to reconnect with her. I haven't tried hard enough, I have to say. I mean, this is a part of trying. Writing the book, I learned a great deal, and it was enormously helpful. Right, and it's very hard for me to know what the difference is. We're all, everybody with a brain feels lonely. I don't know if the loneliness I feel or the loss is different from anybody else's. Everybody goes through separation and loss. But you're right about the conversation. I have to say, my parents were very like Mary. They expressed a great deal without saying it, and they were both very expressive people. So there was definitely a feeling of a subject that caused them a lot of tremendous grief, both of them in different ways. For my father, it was, as you could see, it was an unbearable subject. And when he visited her, it was a wrenching. My mother was a more socially adept person in a strange place than he was, putting it mildly. He was very socially adept in his office. He was, wonderful. But out of Manhattan and in a strange place, no. And my mother she was like an animated bird. I mean, she just was all over the place and very making instant contact with everyone. So she had something to do. So her grief was not so obvious at the residences Mary was at. But my father looked really like it was very hard for him. This was his daughter, I mean, it was very, very painful. I don't know about that. That's a good question. I mean, Bettelheim did appear in the New Yorker. The uses of enchantment and other things. So there was Bettelheim. There was also one of the people who studied Mary turns out to have written or there was a long piece about him in the New Yorker about reading problems in children. Langford. The name has sort of gone out of my mind. I think it's Langford, William Langford. So I don't know that I personally didn't read a lot on the subject in the New Yorker, so I don't know. Burton Rouchet used to write those pieces about unusual medical conditions. Those are very hard for my father to read because he was squeamish about such things, and he fainted at the sight of blood. He was a blood phobic. But Burton Rouchet was a wonderful writer. What will happen to her? I think. Yes, no, I don't think. Frankly, it's not clear, but I don't think they would push her out. I don't think at her age. I don't think they would. I think we've certainly been arguing that it would be very, very traumatic for her to be moved. It was very hard for her to move to another room. Yeah. So, because routine is incredibly important. I mean, she knows everybody's name and what their schedule is and why are they 5 minutes late. So I think she'll be okay. I think she asks after Wally as much as she asks after me. And I think that there's a tremendous feeling of familiarity when we're together. But whether she knows what that comes from, I don't know. Obviously, family means something to her. She doesn't have the same reaction to anybody else. And she never, when I talk about her identifying family photos, she was rarely mistaken in identifying very old photos of everybody. It was like this kind of instantaneous recognition, including of her mother, our mother, way before her birth, with completely different hairstyle and different look. I don't think she cares that much about appearances. She sees the person. She just, the identity is what she fixes on.